All right, OCO everyone. My name is Katherine Foreman Gray, and I am a History and Preservation Officer with the Cherokee Nation. And today we're going to talk about Cherokee Lawmen of the Frontier Era. I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I was born in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and raised in a small community called Warner, which is just south of Muskogee. That's where most people are familiar with the town of Muskogee. And in the area that I grew up in, there was a lot of stories about the notorious Belle Starr and the Youngers, and you often heard these stories about outlaws that would roam the area that I was from. I really never had an interest in it when I was growing up. It seemed like everybody I knew was always claiming to be related to some outlaw or some notorious outlaw that was in the area. And so I never really took a big interest in it until after college, or while I was finishing up my history degree at University of Arkansas. I took an internship over at the Fort Smith National Historic Site in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and it's most famously known as Judge Parker's courtroom. And while I was there and I would start searching through the criminal case files, I started running across some familiar names, some family names, and it really sparked my interest in our outlaw and lawman history. And I found that my great-great-grandfather had been accused of murdering a deputy U.S. Marshal. I found where he had busted out of the Cherokee National Prison at one point and had gotten into a gunfight with Sam Starr. So this was just, when I was able to make that link to my own family, is really what sparked my interest in all of this. When I first started at Fort Smith, I felt like the deputy marshals and the Civil War was really overshadowing the removal story that was there. And then later on, I find myself just as interested in the outlaws and lawmen as well. One of the things that, I'll go back real quick. After I graduated from the University of Arkansas, worked at the Fort Smith National Historic Site. I later went on to Cherokee Nation's Cultural Tourism, and then went to Cherokee Nation. I now work for Cherokee Nation as a History and Preservation Officer. And my obsession, I guess you could say, with some of our outlaw and lawman history has just continued on. And one of the things that I do find when people are coming into these historic sites and talking about the frontier era history, people are always fascinated by the outlaws. And the crimes that some of these men committed were just awful, terrible crimes. And you'll see all of this romanticized to an extent. And it seems like the lawmen really are the ones who aren't receiving the full credit of what they did to try to maintain peace in Indian Territory. So I kind of made it and myself, I get caught up with some of that as well when you start talking about some of our outlaws, because some of them are pretty, you look at people like Henry Starr, and he's a pretty interesting guy, but he was guilty of killing a U.S. deputy marshal. And today we would never do that with people who kill our lawmen or our police officers. We would never put them up and on this, I wouldn't say pedestal, but make sure that their story is told. We would make sure that lawman's story is told. So it's no different, I feel like, from 150 years ago or 100 years ago until today. So it's kind of been my goal recently to make sure that the lawman story starts getting out there just as much as the outlaw stories. So I recently was appointed to the Five Tribes, as a Five Tribes representative to the U.S. Marshals Museum Board. It is a $54 million museum that is going to be located on the Arkansas River in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So I'm really excited about that. It's a great opportunity for the tribes to work with the U.S. Marshal Service and to ensure that our story is told correctly. So Oklahoma, prior to statehood, was known as Indian Territory, and after 1889, Oklahoma Territory was added, taking on the nickname the Twin Territories. So after we were removed west in 1838 and 1839, we had reestablished all of our judicial system, our law, our government. All of that had been established in the east, and we reestablished it in the west. So it was very similar setup as what we had in the east. Real quick, I'll talk about this photo. This is I believe it's 1894. These are some Cherokee lawmen that are guarding the payment for the Cherokee outlet. So I thought it was appropriate and a great photo. So this right here are Cherokee lawmen who were killed during the frontier era. These are just the Cherokee lawmen alone. Now we have other tribal nations who had their own light horse police. You also have deputy U.S. Marshals who are not in this list as well. These are just the Cherokee lawmen that were killed during the frontier era in Indian Territory. To give you an idea of how dangerous Indian Territory was, within a 50-mile radius of Muskogee, Oklahoma, there have been more lawmen killed during the frontier era than anywhere else during that time. And I'll take you to the next slide, and I can also come back. This right here are Cherokee Nation and also U.S. Deputy Marshals who have been killed just inside the Cherokee Nation. So as you can see, it's an extensive list, and a lot of these stories don't make it into these museums and into a lot of literature that we see. So due to some of the circumstances, early light horse had to serve as policemen, judges, jurors, and I'm going to take you back just a little bit on how all of that was organized. So in April of 1797, Benjamin Hawkins, U.S. agent to the Southern Indians, reported on a council meeting of the Cherokees which he attended and stated the tribe was taking steps towards establishing law enforcement officers. Warriors were appointed specifically to assist in preventing horse stealing and in carrying out peace throughout the nation. This right here is a map of Cherokee Nation's original territory in the southeast, which over time and over various treaties gets dwindled down to a small portion in North Georgia and Southern Tennessee. In 1799, this is the first time that we see in this 1797, this is the first time that we see any account where we are taking steps towards establishing a formal law, a law and justice system within the Cherokee Nation. There's a lot of European influence, and so we are pretty much modeling ourselves after the Europeans who are settling around us. In 1799, there is a loose-knit organization of light horse police that is formed by Major Ridge and James Vann. And then in 1808, we do formally pass an act that appoints regulators to suppress horse stealing, robbery, and to protect citizens. We get asked a lot where the term of light horse comes from. It comes from Revolutionary War soldier Henry Lee, who was called Light Horse Harry due to his cavalry movements during conflict. Light horse, among other Indian nations, will soon follow after the Cherokee Nation establishes its own. So after Cherokee removal, we begin to reestablish everything that we had had in the East. Education systems, our government, all of that was being reestablished. We see a report in 1844, the Cherokee Advocate had reported that the Cherokee National Council passed a bill authorizing a light horse company. It was composed of a captain, lieutenant, and 24 horsemen. So Cherokee Light Horse acted as tribal police. They apprehended and turned over criminals to Indian courts for trial and for punishment. Soon after, you will see, after removal, you will also see the other tribal nations that will begin to form their own light horse companies as well. All of these tribes, which were often referred to as the 5 civilized tribes because we had taken on a lot of these European influences and adopted them into the way that we were living. So the other light horse, that's what the 5 tribes are: the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, Creek, Seminole, and then the Cherokee. So these are the other 5 tribes and how they had established their light horse in their tribal nations. So you can see some of the difference. The Seminole light horse were actually one of the most feared of all of the 5 tribes because they were very aggressive and some pretty rough guys that were able to get the job done, no less. So after the American Civil War, which was 1861 to 1865, the Cherokees had aligned themselves initially with the Confederacy, and we were punished for this. Now, the Treaty of 1866, there's a lot that goes into this, and I just pulled out a few things. There was an establishment of a federal court in Indian Territory. We also had to grant right-of-way to the railroads. The Cherokee Nations broke. We were forced to sell the Cherokee Strip and also neutral lands that we had in our possession. And then intruders became a common issue in Indian Territory. Now, these railroads that are coming in are going to be going north to south and east to west. And there's a 1887 map right there of Indian Territory. And the Cherokee Nation is in the northeast corner of that territory. And then you'll see the Choctaw Nation is below us, the Creek Nation to the west of us. And then number 5 is where the Seminole Nation is at that point. And then the Chickasaws in the blue. So even though we had our own judicial system, our own courts, all of that had been established, it was only enforced when there were crimes that were committed, Cherokees against other Cherokees or other tribal nations. For instance, if someone is coming into the Cherokee Nation, a non-Indian, and tries to steal one of my horses and I shoot and kill the guy, we're not going to stand trial inside the Cherokee Nation. We're going to have to go over to the federal court for the Western District of Arkansas, which was located in Fort Smith. So any crimes that were committed, Cherokees against Cherokees, or even if it involved another tribal nation, those would have been dealt with within those tribal courts, depending on where the crime had been committed and which tribal jurisdiction would decide which tribal jurisdiction would decide. So a little bit about Fort Smith and the federal court. Most people are familiar with Judge Parker. He was the federal judge for 21 years from 1875 to 1896. He sentenced 160 to hang. There were 79 total executions under Judge Parker. A lot of people don't realize that he was a big supporter of American Indian and African American rights, and he believed that the U.S. federal government was responsible for the rampant crime in Indian Territory. So you could only be hung for rape or murder. Those were the only 2 things that you could be hung for in the federal court. So in 1874, the federal government orders the consolidation of Indian agents for the 5 tribes. Prior to that, the Cherokee agent was at Tahlequah, the Choctaw and Chickasaw were at the Boggy Depot, and the Creek agent at Okmulgee, and the Seminole at Wowoka. The agent for the 5 civilized tribes moved into a new building at Muskogee on January 1st of 1876. The new office was called the Union Agency. In February of 1880, Colonel John Tufts, U.S. agent for the Union Agency of Muskogee Indian Territory, organized a unit of Indian police to operate throughout the 5 civilized nations. The policemen were recruited from light horsemen from various nations. The official title for this group was United States Indian Police. It is interesting to note that also in the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations, they had county or district sheriffs who were appointed by Indian political leadership. Many of the larger Indian towns also had constables. So the U.S. Indian Police was headquartered at Muskogee. They could travel throughout the nations of all 5 tribes in pursuit of Indian citizens accused of a crime. Many of these were also deputized as U.S. deputy marshals as federal possemen so that they could pursue and arrest non-citizens. They were paid a salary by the U.S. government ranging from $5 to $15 a month. And as I mentioned, common duties were arresting Indian and non-Indian criminals throughout the 5 tribes, removing illegal squatters and intruders, but their main duty was upholding federal laws that prohibited introducing liquor in Indian Territory. In 1875, for the purpose of reformation as well as punishment of offenders, the Cherokee Nation builds the Cherokee National Prison. I take this quote from the Cherokee Advocate, built of sandstone rock made to hold the most hardened and dangerous prisoners, although we do know that there were multiple escapes from this prison. It was the only penitentiary building in the entire Indian Territory from 1875 to 1901. It housed sentenced or accused prisoners from throughout the territory. This was the first time that a tribal nation had tried to rehabilitate its criminals. So before this, you pretty much would have your punishment. If you had murdered somebody, you were going to be executed. But this was the first time that we were going to try to rehabilitate our prisoners and make them productive citizens after they were released. And this right here is the United States District Court at Muskogee Indian Territory, which was authorized by Congress in 1889. So probably one of our most famous lawmen is Samuel Sixkiller. He was definitely an outstanding Deputy U.S. Marshal in Indian Police. At the age of 19, he had joined the Union Indian Artillery Company under the command of his father, First Lieutenant Redbird Sixkiller, during the Civil War. In 1875, Sixkiller was appointed High Sheriff of the Cherokee Nation and was warden. He was the first warden as well of the Cherokee National Prison. On February 12, 1880, Sixkiller became the first captain of the United States Indian Police headquartered at Muskogee Indian Territory. As captain, Sixkiller had 40 men under his command. Besides this position, Sixkiller also held a commission as a Deputy U.S. Marshal and a special agent for the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Sixkiller's duties included policing the streets of Muskogee, one of the most dangerous towns, as I mentioned before. The most notable apprehension of Sixkiller was the notorious outlaw Dick Glass. In 1885, Sixkiller, along with Captain Charles LaFleur of the Choctaw Light Horsemen and Deputies Gooden and Murray of the Cherokee rancher, McClellan, formed a posse and tracked Glass into the Creek and Seminole Nations. Glass's gang had run into Denison, Texas to procure a load of whiskey. The posse would lay in wait at Colbert's Landing on the Red River. Captain Sixkiller ordered the men to surrender and a gunfight ensued. Dick Glass and Jim Johnson were both killed. The driver of the wagon was apprehended a short while later after surrendering to policeman LaFleur. So the death of Samuel Sixkiller happened on Christmas Eve of 1886. Alf Cunningham tried to pick a fight with a Creek Light Horseman, Tom Kennard. He was unable to shoot him, and as Mrs. Renfro went to retrieve his pistol from him before the altercation. So at approximately 4:30 or 5 in the evening, Cunningham had enlisted the help of his brother-in-law, Dick Van. Both men were unarmed as they went about trying to procure firearms at a local store. A shopkeeper, C.W. Turner, seeing that both of the men were drunk and up to no good, refused to sell the men pistols. This led to the pair to spot the city marshal, Shelley Keyes. They attacked Marshal Keyes and probably would have shot and killed him had there not been any witnesses, and they set off with his shotgun and his pistol. So at the same time, Deputy Marshal Sixkiller was leaving Turner's store after retrieving some medicine. He hadn't been feeling well. Cunningham and Van approached Sixkiller, and Cunningham leveled the shotgun at him. Sixkiller knocked the firearm to the side and avoided harm, only to be shot repeatedly by Van. The two men sped off and were reported to be not been found by the posse that had pursued them. Some accounts state that they did later find justice at the hands of Martin and Luke Sixkiller, some of Sam Sixkiller's family. Sam Sixkiller was dead at the scene. His death is important because it was after his death, the United States legislature passed a bill, which was signed by the president, that made assault on an Indian federal police officer a federal crime. The document was signed March 2nd of 1887, and it was a landmark case which increased the stature of Indian police officers in Indian Territory and elsewhere in the United States. Frank West, he was the brother to John C. West, who was the last captain of the United States Indian Police in Indian Territory. Frank had shot and wounded Sam Starr, who was the husband of the notorious and well-known Belle Starr, and he was also the son of Tom Starr. And Frank West had been arresting Tom for robbing the U.S. Mail Service on September 16th of 1886. So on December 17th, 1886, West and Starr ran into each other at a Christmas dance at a farm near Whitefield in present-day Haskell County. Starr approached Frank West, words were exchanged, guns were drawn, and both men were mortally wounded in the gunfight. Seyquoyah Houston, who was a deputy sheriff for the Tahlequah district. And these are just a couple of the men that I'm touching on because there's, obviously you saw the list, there's quite a few that are in there. But Seyquoyah Houston's also a notable lawman that was killed. He was killed by Cherokee Bill, whose real name was Crawford Goldsby. He was a member of a posse that had been organized by Leonard Williams, who was sheriff of the Tahlequah district. They were attempting to arrest the Bill Cook gang at a stagecoach station located between Tahlequah and Fort Gibson. Goldsby later became one of the most famous outlaws in Indian Territory. He was part of the Cook gang. Jim Cook, who was Bill's brother, was caught and tried in the Cherokee courts for Houston's killing. He received 8 years at the Cherokee National Prison for manslaughter. Jim Cook did manage to escape while he was in prison there, but he was recaptured and eventually served the remainder of his sentence. There's a little bit about Cherokee Bill. He was only 19 when he was hung by Judge Parker. He was part Creek, part Cherokee, and African American. Although, as he said in one of his interviews, he was half Cherokee, half Creek, and half black. So that doesn't really add up, but that's what he had said. His real name was Crawford Goldsby. He played a role in 7 murders along with the Cook gang. He was sentenced to hang by Judge Parker in 1896. While he was in prison there, he was able to get a gun smuggled into the Fort Smith jail, and then he would eventually kill a guard there by the name of Larry Keating. It was Henry Starr, who had been on the same, who had been in jail with him there, that was able to finally get the gun from Cherokee Bill, because the gunfight that ensued there lasted for quite a while, at least an hour. And this is the hanging. We actually don't have any photos of the gallows at Fort Smith, so this is the only sketch that there is out there of the Fort Smith gallows. These were a circus-like atmosphere. Now, after Parker gets there in 1875, he has a fence put up around the gallows, and at that point you had to have a ticket to be able to get in to view the hanging. But they say at Cherokee Bill's execution, even though you couldn't get in, there was still about 3,000 to 5,000 people at his hanging. So another well-known Cherokee lawman that we have is Zeke Proctor, who as a boy had came to Indian Territory over the Trail of Tears. He was a small boy when the removal happened. And he lived in the Goingsnake district, which was only about 5 miles from the Arkansas line. He was educated in schools that were operated by the Cherokee Nation, very well respected by his neighbors. He was a prosperous farmer and served as sheriff in his district. So although his doesn't end in tragedy, he wasn't killed during his role as being sheriff or deputy U.S. Marshal. It did definitely have tragedy in his story. He, in 1872, which is known as the Goingsnake Massacre, that year, the 1872 Goingsnake Massacre occurred at a courthouse. But it all begins at the Beck Hildebrand Mill. And this is a photo of that in 1920. The mill has been disassembled. It no longer is standing there, although I believe that preservation, they partially have a part of this mill still remaining. But Zeke Proctor found his sister, who had been married to a man by the name of James Kesterson, living in terrible condition. And James Kesterson, who had worked at this mill, left Zeke's sister, went and moved in with a woman by the name of Polly Beck Hildebrand. They were together. He completely abandoned Zeke's sister, and they were living in terrible conditions. Zeke was upset about this. He went to confront Kesterson at the mill. He pulls out his gun. He's going to shoot Kesterson, and Polly Beck jumps in front of James Kesterson, who is a non-Cherokee. He is married to a Cherokee woman, initially Zeke's sister, and then later Polly Beck. And so he is considered a citizen of the Cherokee Nation at that point because he was intermarried. But Polly jumps in front of Polly jumps in front of Kesterson, and she is the one that is shot and killed. So we have a Cherokee that has killed another Cherokee, so we're going to stand trial inside the Cherokee Nation. But what Kesterson does is run to Fort Smith and says that Zeke Proctor tried to shoot and kill him. And the court there issues a warrant for Zeke's arrest. Zeke has already turned himself in to the Cherokee Nation courts, and he's going to stand trial in the Cherokee Nation for the murder of Polly Beck. So Cherokees already knew that there was going to be trouble with this, so they had moved the trial from the Goingsnake courthouse over to the Whitmire School, and the marshals were instructed to not arrest Zeke Proctor unless he is found not guilty of Polly Beck's murder. And so one of the problems that they did, though, was that they put Polly Beck's family members on the posse that was supposed to go and arrest Zeke Proctor, which you never do that. And everybody's tempers are flying, people are angry. When they get there, court's in session, but Cherokees say that the marshals fired first, the marshals will say that the Cherokees fired first. At the end of the day, there's 11 people who are killed. There's a huge gunfight that ensues. And just on the Cherokee Nation side, this right here are the people that were wounded or were killed. You have Zeke Proctor, who is the defendant, who is wounded. Moses Alberty, who is a defense attorney, is killed at the scene. Johnson Proctor, who is Zeke's brother, was dead at the scene. Andy Pallone, dead at the scene. John Proctor was wounded. Even the judge was shot. He was wounded in the wrist. Isaac Van, Ellis Foreman, and Joe Cheney. All of these men were wounded. This is just on the Cherokee side. On the federal government side, which did include some Cherokees, all in all, we had 8 men that were Cherokee that were killed that day, although the Becks were on the side of the federal government because they were the ones who had joined with the posse to go and arrest. These are members of Polly Beck's family, and it was common to have, as we mentioned, to have Cherokee marshals or Cherokee police officers as deputy U.S. marshals, and then they would also bring men on as their posse. So you had White Soot Beck, who was wounded, Black Soot Beck, who was killed, George Selvage was dead at the scene, Sam Beck was killed, William Beck died the following day, William Hicks dead at the scene, Paul Jones, George McLaughlin were both wounded, Jim Ward, Riley Woods, and Deputy U.S. Marshal Jacob Owens all would be killed. This is the largest loss of life for the U.S. Marshal Service. We will be putting, this is going to be a prominent exhibit in the U.S. Marshals Museum, which I talked about a little bit earlier, which is the $54 million museum that we will be putting on the Arkansas River. And again, I just wanted to bring a little bit of attention to the men who were killed during the frontier era. These are the Cherokee Lawmen alone that were killed during the frontier era working for the Cherokee Nation. So there's a lot of familiar names that are on there. This doesn't include, as I mentioned before, any of those that were with other tribal nations who also were killed in the line of duty as well. A rendering of the U.S. Marshals Museum that will be built on the Arkansas River. This is a national museum that is being built, so it's been, I think we're working on about 10 years now that we've been going on getting this up and going. And one of the most prominent exhibits will be the Goingsnake Massacre. Does anyone have any questions? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Roy might have a little bit better, I don't know, I'm not sure if Roy would. We have a genealogist. We would definitely be interested. And for anyone that's out there that was listening or couldn't understand, it was talking about the a photograph that he had of Zeke Proctor, which if there's ever anything that people want to donate, some people do it on loan for the Cherokee Nation for our different museums. It's, I'll definitely give you my contact and contact and see what we can work out, because anything that's out there that's Cherokee, of course, we would love to get our hands on. So, There probably is. If you go to Fort Smith, for instance, all of the records are in the National Archives, and most of those are in Fort Worth, Texas, that relate to Parker's Court. They have a huge number of records there for any of the Deputy U.S. Marshals. You can also go online to nps.gov/FOSM, and that is where there's a lot of information there on Fort Smith National Historic Sites website, and they have listings of all of the deputy U.S. Marshals that were killed in the line of duty, as well as marshals that they have been able to document in their court. At the U.S. Marshals Museum? Oh, I'm sure they are. They're working on pretty much trying to have a national education center of sorts, and they've been doing a ton of research or outreach right now, and just continuously researching. There's a man by the name of Robert Ernst who has done a lot of research on the U.S. Deputy Marshals, and especially those that were killed in the line of duty, and he would be, he's usually the guy I go to when I have information or seeking information on Deputy Marshals. And Art Burton as well, who has done a lot of research on the Indian police in Indian Territory. But I think that's going to be one of the goals of the U.S. Marshals Museum, is to make sure that there's a lot of access to records. I know that that's one thing that we have brought up, is you're going to have a lot of people that are coming in wanting to research family. So I think that's definitely going to be one of the goals of that museum, is to try to do outreach like that.
I know you said that the disagreement about who shot first, but are there detailed rival accounts of events?
He asked who had the multiple accounts on who had shot first. It's there is an account out there where the Cherokees, I honestly think the Cherokees probably did shoot first. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but I think the Cherokees probably were the ones that that did shoot first, the marshals were riding up to the Whitmire School, and which they had moved it to the school because it was a one-room schoolhouse. There were hardly any windows. I believe there was maybe 1 or 2 windows in each side. There was one way in and one way out. And marshals were surrounding the building. I don't know if they were trying to enter it or not, but there's multiple accounts, and some are saying that the Cherokees shot first, some say the marshals shot first. But all in all, it was, after the trial, Zeke Proctor's acquitted the next day. So and then he later becomes a deputy U.S. Marshal, has a commission out of the same Fort Smith court, which is pretty ironic. But I don't think we'll ever know, because that's just one thing that we constantly debate today. I personally think maybe the Cherokees did, but I'm not even sure of that. I do know you do not put victim's family on a posse to go in and arrest somebody. That is, you just would never do that. So that should not have happened in the first place. And the federal court should not have been there. James Kesterson was considered a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He had lived among the Cherokees for many years. He had been married to a Cherokee. He left the wife, went and moved in and basically married another Cherokee woman. He was considered at that time a Cherokee citizen by intermarriage. And the federal court had no jurisdiction, and they later say this. They realized that they were in the wrong on this. They never should have been there. Kesterson was trying to play both sides of that. He ran to Fort Smith after he was, shot at. I think he was wounded a little bit in the arm, but Fort Smith should have never came in and extended jurisdiction over any of that. So that was where we really had that jurisdictional conflict between the Cherokees and the federal government. We had our own laws, our own system of justice, and that court having jurisdiction over when non-Indians were involved, we felt like it wasn't a fair court. I mean, today we have a mixed jury if you're going to stand trial. There's men, there's women, it's racially mixed. That wasn't the case back then. It was white men who sat on these juries. So Cherokees had a very negative view of this court. It wasn't a very popular court within any of Indian Territory. And so, I don't fault Judge Parker for that. I think he was definitely a man of his time, but he was a big supporter of American Indian rights, and he employed a African-American bailiff. A lot of people don't realize that, but he was, a little bit ahead of his time of sorts as well. But that court was a big issue for most of the tribal nations. It wasn't very well looked upon. So I think I digressed there a little bit, but I'm excited to see the museum. And one of the important things about this museum is that we will be able to tell our story there. The 5 tribes have come together, and we are going to erect a monument on the grounds. It's going to be of a tribal light horseman. So we're really excited to have that project up and going, and it'll probably be up before the museum is even finished. I think we're about finished with the RFP, and we'll get all of our artists involved, and we'll have a bronze statue dedicated to the tribal light horsemen. And I think that's important. And also tribal light horsemen, there's going to be a wall of honor, and tribal light horsemen and posse members will also be included in that wall of honor list that is on that wall. So at the U.S. Marshals Museum. This is a national museum. It's a big deal, and it's had a lot of support from many influential people across the United States. So really excited about it. And it's just, it's important to get the Lawmen story out as much as it is, well, definitely more than the outlaws. They get glorified, and it's kind of frustrating, and I've been drawn into it as well. There's definitely some people that are interesting characters, but it's at the end of the day, they kill the lawmen, and they should never be rewarded even 100 years later for what they did. People know who Cherokee Bill is, but do people know who Cherokee Bill killed? Most people don't. Most people are familiar with the outlaws. You hear of some of the Daltons, you hear of the Starrs, you hear of the Rufus Buck Gang. You know all of these names, but do you actually know the lawmen that they killed, or the crimes that they were committing? And most people don't. So I think it's important that we get their story out and start making it the center of attention instead of the outlaws. So, yeah, go ahead.
This is a little bit of a field from what you're talking about, but why was the Cherokee Nation experiencing physical problems in 1866?
Oh, 1866, the Treaty of 1866. We had been punished for our role in the Civil War. We initially had aligned with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. We had signed a treaty with the Confederacy. We tried to stay neutral, but the U.S., the Union, had pretty much abandoned the Cherokee Nation. All the action is going on out here in the East, and Cherokee Nation and Indian Territory was pretty much abandoned by the Union. And the Confederacy initially had a little bit stronger, had more of a stronghold in Indian Territory. And a lot of the Cherokees, we had been from the South, Georgia, South Tennessee, and we were accustomed to more of that lifestyle. There was a lot of people who wanted to side with the Confederacy, although Principal Chief John Ross did try to keep us neutral. But at the end of the day, we ended up signing a treaty with the Confederacy, which we were punished for. We quickly, not too long after, though, refuted that treaty, and pretty much were strong-armed into signing that. So the United States had cut off all the payments that they had been promised. There was, nothing was coming in. So that was one of our reasons. The Confederacy had made a lot of promises to us. So, but we were punished for that. There was a number of things, as I mentioned in here, but one of those that really brought the intruders into Indian Territory were the railroads. So we had to have that, had to allow railroads to come in. And at first they come in north and south, and then east and west. And with it just brings a flood of intruders. At Oklahoma, at the end of Indian Territory, when Oklahoma was established in 1907, I believe the statistics are 4-to-1 of non-Indians in Indian Territory compared to the citizens of the tribal nations. And I believe that's even more for those in the Chickasaw Nation. There was actually even more than 4-to-1. But in the Cherokee Nation, I think that's the estimate that we use. But we were forced to sell lands, allow other tribal nations to come in as well with that treaty. So there's a lot of concessions that were made. But some of those concessions that we made were because we also because the Cherokee Nation was divided during the Civil War. And even after the Civil War, you had a group of Cherokees who were advocating for a separate Southern Cherokee Nation. And it was supported by many people in the federal government, and John Ross, Principal Chief, had made a lot of concessions in order to keep the Cherokee Nation together and united. So that was part of that. To keep it together, we had to make some of these concessions. So, any other questions? Well, I hope I answered everything okay. You guys had any other questions? And then we have Roy's coming up next doing some Cherokee genealogy.